Do we live in a simulated universe? Do multiple versions of ourselves exist in parallel universes, living out their lives in different timelines? An MIT computer scientist and Silicon Valley game pioneer explores these topics from a new lens, that of simulation theory. If we are living in a simulated universe composed of information that is rendered around us, then many of the complexities and baffling characteristics of our reality start to make more sense. In particular, the two most popular interpretations of quantum mechanics, the Copenhagen interpretation and the many worlds interpretation, which are thought to be mutually exclusive, can be unified in an information-based framework. Quantum computing lets us simulate complex phenomena in parallel, allowing the simulation to explore many realities at once to find the most quote-unquote optimum path forward. Could this explain not only the enigmatic Mandela effect, but provide us with a new understanding of time and space? Bringing his unique trademark style of combining video games, computer science, quantum physics, and computing with lots of philosophy and science fiction, our special guest will share a new way to think about not just our universe, but all possible timelines in the multiverse.
You are listening to Veritas. If this is your first time, welcome home. To listen to tonight's full interview and all of our material, join the Veritas family and click on the subscribe button at veritasradio.com. You can make your purchase with a credit card, PayPal, cash, check, money order, and even cryptocurrency. Don't forget to visit the Veritas store for focused life force energy, MMS, rebounders, pure organic sulfur, flash drives with all our Sanitas and Veritas seasons, and other great products. And if you want to get in touch with Mel, want to be a guest on this radio program, have a guest suggestion, or have feedback, just click on the contact button of our website at veritasradio.com. And now, here's your host, Mel Hostelrick.
Rizwan Virk is a successful entrepreneur, venture capitalist, video game pioneer, best-selling author, and indie film producer. Riz writes on the intersection of science, science fiction, business, and spirituality. His startups, articles, and books have been featured in TechCrunch, Inc., Vox.com, The Boston Globe, NBC News, Coast to Coast AM, and even The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Riz received a bachelor's degree in computer science and engineering from the MIT and a master's degree in management from Stanford's Graduate School of Business. His latest book is titled The Simulated Multiverse. An MIT computer scientist explores parallel universes, the simulation hypothesis, quantum computing, and the Mandela effects. His website is zenentrepreneur.com. Rizwan Virk joins us from Tempe, Arizona. Hello, Riz, and welcome to Veritas.
Hi, thanks for having me on. I'm doing well.
Well, Riz, I've been trying to interview you for quite some time, and I'm glad you're here. But before we begin, let me say that I remember playing a computer video game back in 1989 called SimCity. And even back then, the thought of us living in a video game or a simulated reality came to mind. What if our lives are mostly scripted and everything that happens around us is part of a carefully orchestrated script or a computer code? Back then, when I mentioned it to others, they simply said that I was reading too much science fiction and laughed at me. I know this is still fringe to many, but this notion is supported by many scientists, philosophers, and even religious scholars, right?
Yeah, well, like you, I played video games back in the day, going all the way back to the 80s, when I had an Atari system where we had our joysticks and we were playing these, classic games like Pac-Man or Space Invaders.
Yep.
And, there was a game called Pole Position, which was a racing game. And I remember thinking, even as a kid, as I watched the car go around the track, I'd see these people in the bleachers and I'd see some mountains off in the distance. And I'd always wonder what was beyond the mountains. Was there a virtual world, inside this video game? And of course, I didn't know enough about computers or how they work back then to really ask that as a serious question. And, the quality of graphics back in the 80s were, 8-bit, maybe 16-bit towards the end of the 80s. They were so bad that no one would take that question seriously. But, even in the 80s, there were science fiction depictions with the holodeck on Star Trek: The Next Generation, for example. And so I think over the years, as our video game technology has gotten better, that question has become, less and less strange and less purely science fiction. I mean, it turns out the tools that are used to build video games are the exact same tools and techniques that are used in special effects in movies. And so we can get very good resolution today for a digital object, to the point where if you're watching a movie like Blade Runner 2049 or one of the Star Wars films, you might not know where the CGI ends and the physical thing is there. And so, I think that has been one of the main factors in causing this to be less of a fringe topic, perhaps, than it was in the past, because we can see that our video games characters, storylines, scenery are getting more and more realistic. And even in 1999, which was the year that The Matrix came out, and this topic got, certainly some attention. Even back then, most people wouldn't take the idea seriously, and they'd say it's just science fiction. And so that's, one of the things that has caused it to be taken more seriously now. I actually got involved more seriously back in 2016 when I was playing a virtual reality ping pong game. And while I was playing the game, the responses felt so real in terms of when I would hit the ball and how I had to move my arm. Even though the graphics weren't that great, the responsiveness was right on. So you could say the physics engine of that game was actually quite like our physics engine in what we call the physical world. And for a moment, I forgot I was playing a video game. I thought I was really playing table tennis. And I instinctively tried to put the paddle down on the table. And I tried to lean against the table. And of course, there was no table. It was just virtual. And so that's when I began to think about, how long would it take us to get to what I call the simulation point, the point at which we would be able to create simulations which are indistinguishable from physical reality. And so by then, certain, key figures like Elon Musk or Nick Bostrom, who I can talk about in a minute, had already given this idea a little more credibility. So it was at least being discussed within academia and by physicists, and certainly in Silicon Valley, which is where I was. It was being discussed, even more so.
You've been involved in the video game industry and owned and sold a number of companies. Was your involvement in the video game industry the inspiration behind your books?
Well, it was part of the inspiration because, I was involved in creating video games, particularly when the iPhone came out. And the games we made were relatively primitive compared to what the iPhones of today can do. But yet, you could still build these little worlds inside the game. And so when we sold our company, I ended up becoming an investor in a number of different video game startups, including companies like Discord, Telltale Games, which made games based on Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead, which were really popular, as well as some I ran a virtual reality and augmented reality startup accelerator at MIT called PlayLabs, which was at the MIT Media Lab. And so it was during that time that really I started to think more about the technological basis of what the simulation point would really look like. And so I took basic video games, starting with text adventure games back in the 1970s, like Colossal Cave Adventure or Zork 1, 2, and 3 in the 80s, as well as these old arcade games, and brought them forward. And that brought us to stage 3 or 4 or 5 out of 10 stages that I laid out. And so it was partly from projecting forward and trying to figure out, what are the things that people in Silicon Valley will be investing in, and how will virtual reality look in 15, 20 years, in 30 years, how about in 50 years? And that was part of the inspiration for the book. The other inspiration was just that, I had spent sort of a double life, while I was an entrepreneur in the software and video game industries and investor. I had also explored a lot of different states of consciousness, a lot of different practices, ranging from lucid dreaming to Tibetan dream yoga to shamanic journeying. And, so I had spent a lot of time with people in that world, as well as investigating things like UFOs. And so the simulation hypothesis gave me this ability to kind of link my day-to-day work, which is about technology, as well as some of the time I spent with scientists in academic institutions, with kind of the states of consciousness, traditional religion, as well as non-traditional explorations. And I found that the simulation hypothesis was one of the few metaphors that could be a common language, that was spoken between these sides. I mean, 500 years ago, you had religion in charge in the West, and Galileo got in trouble for, saying that the Earth may not be the center of the universe, or by asking people to look at the telescopes using the Copernican model. And so back then, there was this underground group of people who were pushing science. And now we've gone the other way. We've gone where science has become the mainstream dominant paradigm. And they tend to put down the consciousness and the religious side of things. And so these two sides don't always talk to each other. And so that was one of my other inspirations for really getting involved within simulation theory in general.
I want to come back to what you just said, because I think science has become dogmatic in a way. But I remember going from Pong to Atari to where we are today. Now we have virtual reality like Oculus, the metaverse, movies like Ready Player One. How lost are we in the illusion? And how close is humanity to merging with a virtual world that is not real?
Well, as I said, I laid out these 10 stages, and we're about halfway there. And so as our virtual reality gets more photorealistic, as our augmented reality can show objects to us that are not really there, we start to see this convergence between the digital and the physical world. And what 3D printers are showing us is that you can represent pretty much any object with information. And to use another Star Trek metaphor, I brought up the holodeck earlier. The other, one of the other interesting pieces of technology within Star Trek is the replicator. When Captain Picard says, tea or Earl Grey hot, it'll basically manufacture the cup and the coffee or the tea that goes inside. And so today's 3D printers, usually only use one material, but there are already people experimenting with biological 3D printers, and who knows, soon we'll have with liquids as well. There are now companies and research groups that can use human cells to 3D print, pieces of skin, for example, for skin grafts and all these types of things. And so we're seeing it get more and more sophisticated. But then really, I think, once we get to the stage of brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, as they're called, that's when we get much closer to merging the physical reality with the virtual reality. And today, everyone's talking about the metaverse, including, Facebook having changed its name. Zuckerberg announced, as most people have heard by now, they changed its name to Meta because they wanted to be one of the key players in the metaverse. And so, the roadmap for the metaverse turns out is actually very similar to the road to the simulation point that I described. And in the Matrix, you'll remember that the Neo and Morpheus and Trinity, they were all plugged in to the Matrix with this wire into the back of the head. And so that's an example of a brain-computer interface. And there are companies now that are creating BCIs, including Elon Musk's Neuralink, and a bunch of others. And many of them are non-invasive, so they just try to read the electrical signals coming out of the brain, as opposed to requiring this cable that connects in. But there was actually a demo recently that Elon Musk did where they showed a monkey and they taught the monkey to play a video game. Which game was it? It was Pong, right? I think what you mentioned, which was the first widely available video game. For some reason, ping pong keeps coming up, as we talk about this topic. And so the monkey learned to play with a joystick, and then they disconnected the joystick. And so the monkey thought it was still playing with a joystick, but they were reading the brain signals from the monkey's brain, and they could figure out when it wanted to go left or right or up and down, for playing this virtual ping pong game. And so that was showing that we've got the ability to read. We don't know yet how to send signals into the brain, but so that's a very big part of the stages before we would get to build something like the Matrix. But I wrote an essay for Scientific American earlier this year saying the metaverse is coming, but we may already be in it. And so from the point of view of merging with the metaverse and our own virtual reality, I'd say we're still a few decades away, and at the most 100 years out to this theoretical point I call the simulation point. The other thing is AI residents or AI characters within the metaverse. And so those are just starting to come online. You may have heard about the chatbot recently that a Google engineer said it thought that it was
Sentient.
conscious, or it certainly seemed that way. Right? It's called Lambda.
Yep.
And so that was big news recently. And so we're getting closer and closer to having characters, virtual characters that you can have conversations with. There's a chatbot called Kooky, which was part of the original inspiration for the movie Her. I don't know if you saw that
Sure.
movie, where the guy has a relationship with Scarlett Johansson's voice.
Joaquin Phoenix was the actor, right? Joaquin Phoenix.
Yeah, Joaquin Phoenix. That's right. And so the guy who made that film, he was inspired by the chatbot, which has now become Kooky, which is not just a chatbot, but it has an actual character, a visual, avatar, and you can interact with it. And I actually interviewed Kooky on a podcast that I did for my podcast, Simulated Universe, last year. And I posted the video up on YouTube somewhere. But it's interesting to think, we're getting closer and closer to all of these stages, and eventually we'd get to the stage that's depicted in shows like Upload and others, where you can download your silicon consciousness. I mean, your consciousness into silicon, so that you could basically become a resident of the metaverse. Right? And we're kind of getting into, kind of strange philosophical questions about digital afterlife versus biological afterlife and these types of things. But, most scientists believe we're not that far off from meeting any of these individual stages. I personally think we're at least a few decades, if not maybe 100 years, maybe 200 years at the most. But that's not very much time in the cosmic scale of things.
It was interesting that when you were playing virtual table tennis, you actually instinctively put the quote-unquote paddle down onto the quote-unquote table and attempted to lean on the table, just like you might have done after a real table. So the kind of immersion and the fooling the mind is just incredible. But you mentioned Black Mirror, for example. You mentioned Black Mirror in your book, and we'll discuss it later. But just one of the episodes came to mind that you don't discuss in your book. But I don't know if you remember, I forgot the actual title of the episode, but it was a woman who lost her husband, an accident or something happened to him, and a company was able to manufacture a clone of the husband based on the social media life that he had. So when she received the package, she saw the face. He looked much younger, no wrinkles, and they said, "Oh, it's because people usually use filters." You remember that episode?
I didn't see the episode, but it's very much based on this idea of a digital afterlife.
Exactly.
And there was a woman in Russia who, she had a friend who died, and she created a chatbot based upon, all of the social media posts from that person. And then there was another one, I forget the name of it now. I think it was called like Virtual Dad or something like that, where some guy did that for his father, and it was a chatbot that was out there, and it got a lot of attention a few years ago. And so we're already seeing the beginnings of that, which is that because we produce more information through our lives now that's digitized than ever before, that information is available to train an AI that might look and sound like you. I mean, most people have heard of deep fakes now, where you can have an image generated by AI that starts to look very realistic. And generally speaking, if you just see the picture, it's hard to tell now. They've gotten so good. If you look at like Epic, which is the parent company of Fortnite, they have metahumans, but it's gotten to the point where if you just look at a static image, it's almost difficult to distinguish between a virtual character and a real character. And there are virtual characters now that have millions of followers on YouTube and Instagram and other places like that. And so we're seeing this technology advance. And of course, if you take it to its logical conclusion, it's that one, you would be able to upload that consciousness. And some people think that it's just a matter of being able to map all the neurons in the brain and the connections between those neurons, that's what's called the connectome. And so if they can do that, they can go further than just the social media posts or the pictures that have been out there. They can actually, basically get the memories and everything that's in there. That's a controversial area, right? Because that assumes that consciousness is simply an emergent property of the physical neurons and the connections. And so, there's a debate within simulation theory, and actually not that many people talk about this, but I think it's actually one of the most important aspects of simulation theory. And it's what I call the NPC versus the RPG. versions or flavors, perhaps is a better word, of the simulation hypothesis. And in the NPC version, we're all simulated on a computer, and we're all like the NPCs, the non-player characters in video games. Like, you may have a bartender at a bar, or a bank teller, or just random people wandering around that are just AI. And so, when most academics talk about simulation theory, they're talking about that version. But there's the other version, which is the virtual reality version, which is RPG, which is a role-playing game version, where our characters are avatars, just in the same way when I play Fortnite, or I play World of Warcraft, or No Man's Sky, or League of Legends, I have my avatar inside the game, but I'm not the avatar. I'm still outside the game, but from the perspective of what's inside the game, that's all I see. And the Matrix actually was closer to the RPG version. Yeah, there were some AIs like Agent Smith and some of the other programs, but primarily it was about immersing yourself completely in there. And so that gets back to this question of, can you have consciousness simply from the physical body, which would mean basically having an avatar, or what I like to call AVIs, AI avatars in the metaverse. And if you reproduce like that woman in the Black Mirror episode, I'll have to watch it now. Who brought back her husband. And of course, in that episode, was it a virtual or a physical?
It was a physical, but the actual, whatever his memories, consciousness was based on his Facebook, let's call it Facebook life that he had. They accumulated all the pictures, everything he said throughout, the years he had been on social media. And they basically put it all into him, his image, the way he talks, everything. I mean, some of these episodes, I just wonder if somebody's tapping into something else. I mean, you may remember another episode where an individual has something in his chip implanted that records everything. So when he goes to the airport, at the airport, they want to see security. They want to see the last. You remember that episode? It's just incredible stuff.
Yeah, everything is just recorded. And then, there's a couple and, they've recorded what they were doing earlier in the night. And then they're arguing, why were you talking to us? Why were you doing this? It's almost like where we don't want full recall. But yeah, Black Mirror is great because it raises these issues, not just about the technology, but really about the social dimensions of this technology and what impact, could it have on individuals and on society and our relationships.
I wanted to ask you this question at the end, but you brought up the NPC and RPG. Are we in an NPC role right now or an RPG version of the simulation?
Well, that's the big, $64 million question, right? That, science is struggling with and hasn't quite figured out. If you look at the simulation hypothesis as it's talked about by a lot of academics, it was put forward by a philosopher from Oxford named Nick Bostrom. And he wrote a paper all the way back in 2003 called Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? And, it ties a little bit to the earlier discussion that we had and my thoughts on when we'll reach the simulation point. And so, he came up with this idea that really there were three possibilities for technological civilization. One, it never reaches that point, which means it can't create a bunch of simulations. Or two, it reaches the point and it decides not to create any simulations by law or something. Or three, it reaches the point and it creates lots and lots of simulations. And so his argument was that if three is true, in any case, anywhere in the physical universe, let's say in the galaxy, you could be talking about a civilization that's 1,000 years or 10,000 years or 1,000,000 years more advanced than we are, right? And so if they're able to create these simulators, they would create lots of them. All you have to do is crank up another server, and you've got another billion people, another trillion people in 1 billion different simulations. And so he came to the conclusion that says, if it's possible, then you are most likely living in a simulation. Why? Because there's only so many people in base reality, and there's only one base reality, but there's a huge number of people that are simulated, or AI or NPCs in this case, and there's a huge number of simulated worlds. And so if you just had to do the probability that says, okay, you're in a world, there's only one of these, there's a lot of these, which are you in? Or you're a being, and there's so many simulated beings, but there's 1,000,000 times more. There's so many physical beings. There's 1,000,000 times more simulated beings. which are you more likely to be? And so his was a probability-based argument. And so when a lot of people talk about the simulation hypothesis, they're talking about that specific simulation argument that Bostrom made, which is that we're more, and Elon Musk a few years ago also talked about video games going back to Pong and how we're where we are today. And he came to the conclusion that the chance that we are in base reality, i.e. that we're not in a simulation, is 1 in billions, right? Which means it's pretty likely we're in a simulation. And that was based on that logic. But that logic does very much rely on there being lots and lots of NPCs. Now, personally, I'd like to point out that these two are not mutually exclusive, right? When you play an online game, whatever it is, EVE Online, any of these games, you have your avatar and then you have the NPCs in there. So you actually have both within that environment. Personally, I tend to favor the RPG version, which says that we are the players. We are outside the game and we have put on the quote unquote virtual reality helmet and we have just forgotten what it was like outside the game. And there's a great, Rick and Morty episode about that where, the game is called something like, A Life Well Lived or something like that. And the guy puts on the VR headset and in there he lives an entire life from being born, going to school, getting married, having kids, getting old, and then dying. And when he dies, he takes off the helmet and it's only been 15 minutes. But to him, it's been a whole life. He's like, wait, where's my wife? Where's my kids? What's going on? Why am I here? And I think it's a little bit closer to that. And that's what many of the religions have been telling us all along, that this physical world around us, is not the real world.
But you just said, again, you're saying things, and it just reminds me of things that I've seen in the past. You may remember the movie Strange Days. Do you remember that?
I don't think I saw that one. I heard about it.
Strange Days. I wanted to bring this up later because I think that if virtual reality becomes so equal and so immersive, it could become an addiction. And that's what that movie showed. Basically, people, instead of going to the corner drug dealer, they would go to the corner person selling virtual reality that you could put into this, things you could connect to your head, and you would experience anything you wanted, whether it was sex, whether it was going on vacation to a place you never thought you could go to, you name it, but it became an addiction. But also you mentioned the deep fakes. Since you were in the belly of the Silicon Valley area, do you remember the presentation that Adobe made years ago about Project Voco?
Project Voco. I heard of it. I don't remember seeing the presentation, but I remember hearing about it.
Project Voco, they would take the speech of someone and clone it to allow you to change their words and even add new phrases. But there were legal concerns, and even the national security apparatus stepped in and said, nope, you cannot release it. So they immediately, abruptly stopped it. But what I saw in that presentation was scary because they could actually, use your voice, and now we have deep fakes. Imagine if they create a video of you doing something you shouldn't be doing. Imagine the legal ramifications.
Absolutely. And the voice technology is now out there. Like there's a number of companies that basically clone your voice. And you basically speak, 50 sentences, right? And then you can use that. They can use that to generate. Now, it's not perfect because you have to tweak it. But if you trained it with way more than just the 50 sentences, if you trained it on a larger set, there was a group at ASU actually that had a video they wanted to be narrated by, I forget who it was. Maybe it was Sir Richard Attenborough or it was one of these well-known individuals from the past who had passed away. And they were able to, using the clips that were available of him, to clone his voice and then use it for the video. Now, the video wasn't necessarily him there, so they haven't married it yet with the deep fakes. But yeah, it's getting to the point where I think you give it a decade, certainly 5 years to a decade, the deep fakes will get very good. I mean, today there's still that uncanny valley, they call it, which is that, you can start off with very simple, 2D avatars that look nothing like humans. And the closer you get to looking like human, the more odd it seems to people because they know something's wrong and they can't quite figure out what, but it just doesn't feel right. And so there's this point at which if you try to get too close and too realistic, it brings up this uncanny valley. And today, even though the deep fakes are good for pictures, like they're not so good for movements like talking and for moving around. You can kind of tell something's off, right? But with more data and more training, this will get, better and better. And just like we have these characters inside movies, whether it's Gollum going back to the Lord of the Rings all the way back in 2000, was it 2002 or 3 that the second movie came out? That they had, this virtual character, and so you're seeing more and more of those. And there are now tools that, like, if I sit in front of my Zoom call, I can move my arms and do things, and then it'll show an avatar to the other side that's not me, but it's doing the exact same things I'm doing. And even Roblox and others are working on this kind of technology. And so it'll get to the point where we will be able to do that. But I did want to talk about the addiction thing you mentioned, because I think that's a really important issue. Even though I hadn't seen that movie, there's a well-known book about the metaverse called Ready Player One, in which everybody goes to school in the Oasis, which is like their sort of metaverse, and people work in the metaverse. That's where they get jobs. But it's relying on these very slim virtual reality goggles, unlike the ones we have today, which are still pretty big. So he wrote that back in 2010, 2011. And in the book, I think it was like 2045 was the year. But we're already almost caught up to what he depicted in terms of technical ability. So then he came out with a new book. The movie for Ready Player One came out in 2018, directed by Steven Spielberg. But then Ernest Cline, who wrote the original book, wrote Ready Player 2 in 2020. And in that, they upgraded the metaverse so you didn't need the goggles, but it was a brain interface where you just kind of put this little band on your head and it projects, right into the brain. And in that, one of the main issues was, just like in the movie you talked about, is, well, if you can experience it, it actually feels real, because in that case, they're sending impulses, electrical impulses into the brain. You could basically go to India without having to have, the issues you might have with the food, or you could travel, or have, like you said, have any kind of sexual experience you wanted to, and it would feel real. And, Philip K. Dick got into a lot of these types of scenarios with Total Recall and others. And so the question was, will people just give up on going out in the real world? I think it's an open question, but I do think there is the possibility of that. That said, I think we're still a bit a ways from being able to do that. Even the goggles are cumbersome, and we don't have any kind of haptic stuff. I mean, we have the haptic gloves and suits, but they're very cumbersome right now to wear. But give it a decade or two, and then if you can send electrical impulses, which reminds me of that scene in The Matrix where Morpheus, who's named after the Greek god of dreams, is asked by Neo, "Is this real?" Right? Because he took him out of the Matrix and put him in another simulation. And he goes, well, what is real? Reality is a series of electrical impulses to your brain. So from that perspective, it seems real.
Well, you've probably seen some of these holograms of Tupac Shakur or Michael Jackson. If they mix deepfakes in the future and it becomes perfected, because like I said, this Project Voco, I saw it, and it was just 100% realistic. If you could combine those three things, I wonder how many people, that the nostalgia of the 1970s or 80s, what if they say, hey, we have a new concert, new material. Yeah, it's not from Freddie Mercury, but it's the same voice and it's the same thing, but it's new material. Imagine the industry they could create by bringing Michael Jackson, Freddie Mercury, David Bowie, and the rest of them.
Yeah, and that industry it's in its infancy, but it's already starting to form. There are issues around digital rights from the estates of actors and singers for their voice and their image. We already see Lucasfilm, right, bringing back Princess Leia, yeah. Carrie Fisher, who passed away. And, it's still a bit awkward, but there is now a whole, element of this, from the agents to the industry and licensing and who pays for those voices. I think the consensus is, if it's the voice based on the original actor, then they should still be getting a piece of it. But these are open legal issues to this virtual reality world that, are going to be interesting over the next decade or two.
Even Peter Cushing, who's dead, has been dead since 1994, they brought him back and it looked pretty good.
That's right. Grand Moff Tarkin from Star Wars, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it actually looked pretty good. Each movie, they get better at it. And this whole process partly started with, Steven Spielberg and Jurassic Park, back in the early 90s. When before that, they pretty much used physical puppets for these kinds of special effects, and that was the first time. I mean, he almost didn't believe it at first, and then the guys at back to Lucasfilm, I think it was ILM that did the special effects. They showed him they could create dinosaurs that looked somewhat realistic with computers, and that trend has just continued. and now it'll reach the point where obviously for that you needed these big rendering machines, but now it's getting to the point where our desktop renderings are becoming pretty good. So yeah, it'll be very difficult to distinguish in the future.
Speaking of the addiction, most people who abuse drugs or alcohol, they're not only addicted to the substance, but also to escapism. Escapism is a tendency to seek escape and distraction from reality or real life problems. Your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think escapism is definitely there. But I think, for some of us, who grew up before computers and then with video games, but only, sort of the primitive video games, the distinction between escaping versus dealing with real life was much, I think, more distinct than it is with today's generation, right? I mean, the younger generation today spends, as much time in online environments as they do probably out in the real world. And so, for them, there was a survey done recently which said they surveyed Gen Zers, and they found that over 50% of them were just as likely or more likely to spend money on a virtual clothes and sneakers and outfits for their avatars, in Roblox or Fortnite or one of these environments, than they were to actually spend on buying, real world Nikes. Right? Wow. And so this is that generation for whom, and not just because of COVID, I mean, even before COVID, you have hundreds of millions, if not billions of people playing online games. And, Fortnite has become like a socializing place. So you go there and you hang out with your friends within that environment. And certainly with COVID, it even accelerated where they're spending more and more time, online through Zoom and others. So, I mean, I do believe there is this element of escapism. But I think that also, as our digital and physical lives get closer and closer together, that distinction may not be so big. Like the people that we're interacting in the virtual world might be our coworkers, right, in the future. And so, in some cases, escapism is bad because you're ignoring stuff. In another case, you're building, a more distributed virtual life. I spent a lot of time in a virtual world called Second Life back in 2007 and 2008. And it was pretty big back then. It was kind of Metaverse 1.0 is what I like to call it. Whereas what we're trying to build today is kind of like Metaverse 2.0. And, I would come across people that were disabled, for example, and couldn't go out very much. And they would use this as an escape. So there's a positive side to the escape as well as a negative side, to the escape. But I wonder if that's, a distinction that won't be there in another generation.
This is what concerns me about this, because you and I grew up at a time where we knew that playing video games was just a distraction, it's like going to play baseball. But as you say, the newer generations are spending so much time, and even you probably have heard of the avatar depression syndrome. These are people who reported suicidal feelings after seeing the movie Avatar because they missed the beauty of its hyper-realistic world. Do you think that this metaverse may push people into that?
It's possible, right? Because, like I mentioned that book, Ready Player 2, where they had the brain-computer interface. And so within that, they had to limit how much time you could spend per day, like 9 hours or 12 hours, right? Because if you spent more than that, your brain would become confused. And I mean, I think our physical body is used to being in a physical environment, and our brains have evolved within that environment. So, I do think that from that perspective, it could get problematic. But you're seeing that with social media already, where, there are like more teenagers depressed now than there ever were before. And with all these studies, and part of it is because they spend so much time online, but it's not just being online. it's on social media. They're always comparing themselves to other people.
Yeah.
Right. And if you notice I have friends today that are traveling in in Venice and London and Scotland, right, just on Facebook. And I'm like, oh, well, I'm just, hanging out here, going to classes for my PhD. And you can see how it would kind of build up to a weird kind of, the grass is always greener somewhere else. And you can see that being transported into the virtual world as well. But I think we'll get some kind of a balance as well. Like, for example, I was in a class, and so, with undergrads, so there were some and graduate students, but basically mostly kids in their 20s. And one of them told me that, his dad used to tell him, don't spend so much time on the iPhone, right? You're spending too much time on the iPhone when he was a kid, which was not that long ago, right? But he said now he goes home to visit his dad, and his dad is on his phone all the time on Facebook and elsewhere. And he has to tell his father, don't spend so much time on the phone. So, perhaps I think because this generation is growing up with it, it may be a little less, they may be able to deal with it better, I guess is what I'm saying, than those of us for whom that is such a separate thing,
I'm remembering what you just said, that, some people are studying, you're pursuing your PhD, you may have some friends who are traveling, and that, creates a little bit of animosity. But at the same time, there's a flip side of the coin. I remember last time I was in Venice, for example, I observed the gondolas around me, and there was a group of what looked to be college students. And instead of looking around the beauty of Venice, they were all looking at their phones. Do you see that all the time?
Yeah, you see that all the time, right? You see that. And that's why, there's things like screen time. But I have noticed that people are less able. And there's like teenagers who have anxiety over Instagram now. And there have been studies done where they don't want to go to sleep because they might miss, the latest Instagram posting. And so, I think that's a problem. That is definitely with not just with virtual. I mean, the virtual reality is not quite there yet, right? Where, you would want to be immersed in it all the time, but we're already virtual. I mean, you and I are having this conversation not in physical reality. In fact, we're not even really having a conversation. I am speaking to my computer. My voice is being translated into bits, transmitted over the wire, and your computer is re-rendering my voice. So in addition to the thing we talked about earlier, where, with software, you could basically modify what gets rendered on the other side. You could change it. But we're all used to having virtual interactions now, and that's become pretty common. But yeah, I mean, I do think we all need a healthy amount of time in the physical world, and so that's why I think it's important. But that said, when I was a kid, we heard the same thing about TV. Right? We were told TV would rot our brains, and we were told that we're spending too much time on TV, and yet, we were still able to go out and do all of these other things. I think as they start to view it more as a tool of their social relationships, right? It becomes part of their social relationships. Then I do think some people will be able to deal with it better. But yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of on that weird cusp right now. Where this generation is growing up with all of these social media tools, and it's social media in particular, right? And I think we have to think about that as we design the metaverse, moving to the future. It's one thing to be working in the metaverse. It's another to spend all your time socializing in the metaverse. But most of my friends now are not in this city, right? So I end up just interacting with them more on the phone and virtually than on Facebook and social media than in person these days anyway. And so it's just becoming, part of the norm. I mean, perhaps some people thought that when telephones came out too. We don't know. I mean, part of what I'm studying is social dimensions of science and technology. And, there's always these unintended consequences of technology when you roll it out, and you don't always know that beforehand. There's always resistance to it from some part of society. And I don't know this for a fact, but I'm wondering if telephones, which are extremely convenient, right, also ended up creating, some of that for people that prefer to be disconnected. Certainly cell phones did, right? Because you can't go anywhere without people being able to contact you. That was the first time that really happened was back in the 90s. But even if you look at a technology like cars, automobiles, the predicted consequence, the pollution they were worried about was that cars would kick up so much dust from the roads, right? Because the roads were not paved. Right? There were horses and cars on the roads back then in the first part of the 20th century. And that was what the pollution they were worried about. Right? They weren't necessarily worried about fossil fuels. And so there's always an unexpected set of consequences from the technologies that we roll out, and that's pretty much unavoidable.
Well, look at DARPA. I think DARPA was devised in the 1960s more for the military to be able to communicate in the event of nuclear war. And then it was passed on in the 80s to the population, in the 90s mostly for mainstream. And I wonder if they ever visualize what a future would become for the mainstream, the population using the internet. Do you think they imagine how it would become?
I don't think that the military did. I mean, they established DARPA as the Defense Advanced Research Project
Agency, right?
Agency, exactly. And so, they were one of the ways that they built the internet, as you mentioned, was to be able to survive a nuclear war. So they created this decentralized set of name servers. And people have probably heard DNS today, like for their websites and their URLs, but that's really the origin. Is you have a distributed set of databases, which if any one of them goes out, you can still have that information available. And then with the network as well, if any part of the network goes out, you're still able to route information back and forth. But yeah, I don't think necessarily they were thinking of some of these applications, although there were people that were, right? I mean, at Xerox PARC, they were thinking of networked offices. You had people like Jacques Vallée, who has been involved as a computer scientist who was involved in Project Blue Book way back in the 60s,
yep.
And who was the inspiration for the French scientist in Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Right.
But he was also doing research in Silicon Valley around the ARPANET, as it was called at the time, and the internet. And he was already exploring, what it would mean for there to be so many connections and for people to have virtual meetings and things, even back in the 70s, even though really that didn't really happen until the 90s.
Glad to see that you're also immersed in that part of our topics, Jacques Vallée, Close Encounters, and so on. But you mentioned in your book, quote, studies have shown that the brain responds to perceived stimuli in a virtual environment in the same way as it does to real stimuli in a physical environment, end quote. I'm sure this knowledge can be used for many applications, say therapy to overcome fear of things like heights or spiders. This can be simulated safely inside virtual reality. Is psychology and psychiatry embracing this today, Riz?
They're starting to. There are more and more studies being done that show that you can use virtual reality as a therapeutic tool. And that there was one at the University of Oxford recently that showed that you can reduce anxiety. And there were a number of startups in Silicon Valley. So there was a wave when we all thought virtual reality was going to be really big. It was in 2016, 2017, 2018. And there were a lot of startups. And one of them specifically was working with heights and with spiders. And there was another one that a friend of mine started that was for, teen anxiety disorder. And so, many of them had clinical studies that showed that this actually does work. You can reduce your fear. I mean, you're not going to get rid of the fear completely, but if you're able to use this to train yourself to be in the presence of spiders or to be at a great height, it turns out more and more, universities and psychiatrists that are showing this. Now, that doesn't mean they're rolling this out everywhere, but there are also VR companies that allow you to relax and get into different states. Whether just like, there are apps and things on YouTube you can listen to for meditation. When you put a VR headset on, you can there's like a whole biofeedback element that occurs, and you can tell if your heart rate is slowing down. I mean, at Play Labs at MIT, which I was running a few years ago, we had a company that was doing that where if you breathed a certain way, objects would levitate in the virtual reality. But if you breathe too fast or your pulse got too strong, too fast, then they would kind of fall down. And so it was a biofeedback mechanism. But within this virtual environment that kind of made it, it almost seems like you're being psychic here in controlling these things, right? But it's all based on, the body. And so there have been many studies that show that you can have therapeutic effects. Now, is it, how strong is it? That's a good question. I think we'll find out, and how quickly it gets rolled out. It may take years, but within a within a psychiatrist's office or within a controlled environment, like inside a company, it's easier to have a VR headset than necessarily at home. Although with the Quests and wireless headsets, that's becoming easier and easier as well.
You mention a lot Philip K. Dick's work in your book. What do you think he would say? He died in 1982, for those who don't know. What do you think he would say if he were alive today about the advent of so much technology?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, his work was quite interesting because now he's very well known because of the movies, right, that have kind of extrapolated on his work. Whether it started really with Blade Runner being the first one that made a huge impact, and of course we've
Man
had
of the High
many
Castle.
others, and Man in the High Castle, and I can talk about that in a minute in terms of timelines and stuff. But I think that I asked his wife Tessa, who I interviewed as part of our research for my book, what he would have thought of The Matrix, for example. And she said, well, his first reaction would probably be that he liked it. And his second reaction would be, can I sue these guys for stealing my ideas? And so that was pretty funny. But, he had, even in the book that Blade Runner was based on, which was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which came out in the 1960s, I believe, as did The Man in the High Castle was 1960. And in that, there was a whole element called the Mercer machine, where people would plug into this kind of VR-like thing, and it would they would see some shared scene of people, and it would certain colors and emotions. It was like a mood machine almost, and he had several other stories like that as well. So I think he predicted a lot of things, although he didn't always get it right, but he got the essence of these things and how they might blur, right? If you look at Philip K. Dick's work, the two big questions that he raises, and this is scholars that have studied him, and he even said this himself, the two big questions that he explores is, one, what does it mean to be human versus non-human? If you think of AIs, for example, Blade Runner, that was one of the major questions. And the second big question was, what is reality and what is real and what isn't real? And, he explored that in many of his works. And oftentimes there were what he called these pseudo worlds. Some of them were experienced only by one person. Some of them were shared hallucinations of certain types. And so, I think with the virtual reality technology, I think he'd have a field day in creating new, new stories. Part of my research is on something called the sci-fi feedback loop. And, the basic idea is that science fiction often inspires real world inventions and innovation in the real world. And there's many examples from Star Trek, with the flip phone, and Star Trek in general, inspiring people to go into STEM. And there's, many other examples of things that have come out of various science fiction, going back to, the submarine from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, inspiring from Jules Verne, inspiring Simon Lake to build, one of the first seawater submarines out there for the military. And so there's a long history of that. But what happens is things go in waves, is that people get inspired by the science fiction. And since we've been talking about the metaverse term was coined in a science fiction novel by Neil Stephenson back in 1992 called Snow Crash. And in that, he said it was this guy Hiro, who was the actual hero, but his name was spelled Hiro. It was basically beaming these signals to these weird goggles that were sitting on his face that were kind of VR or kind of AR, because you could still kind of look around, and you had an avatar within the metaverse. And so that book is considered kind of a classic in this world, and it inspired a whole group of entrepreneurs to build MMORPG environments, such as Second Life, which came out in 2004, There.com, some in the 90s, and that led to, it was pre-internet. So he envisioned the metaverse as being a kind of internet, but with 3D avatars and virtual reality. But there's a lot of things that developed since then. The web, for one, wasn't even around. And so the real world innovation then went back and inspired the next generation of science fiction writers. And so I mentioned Ready Player One earlier, which many would say is the successor to Snow Crash, as the metaverse book. And that incorporated all the stuff that had been built in the meantime. So you not only had virtual reality, you had web browsers, you could stream videos, you could do instant messaging, all the stuff that had been built as standard part of the internet social media by them was incorporated. And so then that became the inspiration for people who were working on a startup called Oculus. And in fact, they bought a copy of that book, the science fiction book, for every one of their employees, which was founded in 2012. And then, of course, Facebook bought them, and now Facebook is trying to build this entire metaverse off of that. And so you see this loop in motion. So I think if Phil K. Dick was around today, his first reaction would be, wow, this is cool. I'd say it hasn't developed exactly like I thought, but it's interesting. And I think he would go and write some very interesting stories about what happens next.
I don't know why the video game from 1982 or 83, Dragon's Lair. Do you remember that? I remember that. I remember that game because back then every game was $0.25, but this specific game in my arcade was $1. So you had to really become proficient at it. But this is when really things started changing. Almost like every single chapter had a different course, if you will. That's right,
and in fact, that was the first game that used like cartoon-like cutscenes,
correct,
if I remember correctly. And so there was this distinction between the game and watching an animated video, right? And video games and cartoons were completely different things, right? Cartoons were on TV or in theaters. Video games were things you did inside the arcade. But now, as I mentioned earlier, special effects for movies use the exact same 3D models in the exact same tools, like the Unreal Engine from Epic or the Unity 3D engine, to create these special effects. And so it's just showing this convergence. And that was one of the first games where, that those two really started to converge. And now if you look at the trailers for video games, I mean, they're like really high quality trailers, even higher quality than the game itself. But you're looking at it and you're like, wow, this is like a whole production of a movie. And there have been movies based on, whether it's Warcraft, World of Warcraft, or other video games that have been translated. But yeah, I remember the thing with the quarters. In fact, there's a great story about Pong, which was the first widely available video game from Atari, and a guy named Nolan Bushnell had started it, and they had dropped off Pong at some local bars and pizza joints here in Sunnyvale. I was going to say here because I used to live right next to Sunnyvale in Mountain View, but I'm not there at the moment. And so after about a week, one of the owners of the bar called him up and said, "Hey, come get your machine. It's broken. It's not working." And so he was kind of disappointed, thinking, okay, well, I guess people don't want to play these video games. And he went out there to see what was wrong with it and why it was broken. It turns out it wasn't broken at all. People had jammed so many quarters in there that it was full and you couldn't get it to play. So he took out all the quarters and it worked just fine. And that's when, really the video game industry as we know it today began.
A lot of people don't know this, but he was the founder of Charles Entertainment Cheese, better known as Chuck E. Cheese. You knew that, right?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, I think that was a bigger financial success for him than Atari, just in terms of, because he sold Atari to Warner when it was relatively small, compared to
and the fact
$1 billion company. I think,
And just a quick parenthesis, but for years, people speculated that he had buried millions of the E.T., I believe it was E.T., the actual cassette, the actual game in the New Mexico desert. And those who speculated were proven right a few years ago. They actually unburied them. You knew that, right?
Yeah, there's a documentary.
Correct.
I forget the name of it now, but it's available on like Netflix and other places. Game Over? No, I can't remember if it's called Game Over. That was one documentary. But yeah, so, you see the video game industry go through these waves. And one of these waves was the Atari wave. And what happens within these waves is people create original games and then they say, hey, let's create games based on IP, intellectual property, or movies, right? And so there was the Raiders of the Lost Ark game and the E.T. game, and they were trying to push the E.T. game out by Christmas that year.
Prematurely,
even though the developers were saying it's not ready. And, it's really difficult to get the game mechanics right. And Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari, is famous for a phrase that he used. He said, "Make it easy to play, but hard to master." So that's, part of the key to making a good video game. And so, this game was not that fun to play, and finding the fun is the hardest part. And so, there was that whole rumor. Turns out that if they buried them, they could write them off,
exactly.
And take the loss or there's some accounting reasons why. Rather than just giving them away, it was actually better for them to actually bury the inventory. In that documentary, they went back out there and found some.
I'm geeking out with you, by the way, about all of this because some of the people who were pressured, so much pressure, the actual writers of those games did not earn that much money, and they felt so pressured that they decided, you know what, we're going to create, because Atari wanted to have exclusivity of the actual games into that, but these guys, some of them left and created, you probably know this too, Activision, which, by the way, I think it was the best games that were out there for Atari. Well, we have to take a one and only break, but I want to say this before we take a break. When we come back, I want to discuss the Mandela effect, which we discuss here all the time. And also, you mentioned Jules Verne. I sometimes wonder if authors like Jules Verne, who talked about submarines and rockets in the 1800s, and Philip K. Dick, who also had futuristic thoughts, I wonder, Riz, if they get their information from somewhere, almost as if they were in communication with supernatural beings that knew our future. But we'll take your answer on the other side. How can people buy your books, learn more about your work, Riz?
Well, my website is zenentrepreneur.com, and has links for my books, my podcast, and of course the books are available on Amazon, and many local bookstores have it, or you can always order one. I always like to support local bookstores as well. So if you can, get it from a local bookstore. Otherwise, you can get it online easily.
Help local bookstores, folks. I always say that is a species in extinction. We need to support them. Don't go anywhere. I'm here with Rizwan Virk. A lot more when we come back. This is Mel Hostelrick, and you are listening to Veritas. Don't go anywhere.
Thank you for listening to the first part of this important Veritas interview. To listen to the rest, and all of our material, proceed to the member section, or join the Veritas family by subscribing. Click on the subscribe button at veritasradio.com. You can make your purchase with a credit card, PayPal, cash, check, money order, and even cryptocurrency. We are now accepting Bitcoin, Litecoin, and Ethereum. Don't forget to visit the Veritas store for Focus Life Force Energy, MMS, CBD Pure Hemp Oil, Pure Organic Sulfur, flash drives with all our Sanitas and Veritas seasons, and other great products. And if you're listening on YouTube, like, subscribe, and share it. And click the bell to be notified when new interviews are